When the blizzards of December struck, the snow came fast, heavy, unrelenting, burying everything in its path. But Thomas McCall, a lone cowboy with no family but his cattle, had something that might just save them all. A windbreak built from the stubborn lessons of a life spent fighting nature. Before we ride further, tell us where you're listening from, and if Frontier Tales speak to you, hitch your horse at the channel and stay for tomorrow's story. The cold wind began its whisper through the prairie, stirring the snow like the first ominous sigh of a storm yet to come. Thomas McCall stood on the small rise overlooking his herd, his eyes squinting against the sharp wind. 34 years old, he'd seen his fair share of winter in the plains, but there was something different in the air this time, something biting, unyielding. The cattle huddled together, their breath a steady plume of mist against the gray sky. McCall wiped his gloved hand across his forehead, feeling the sting of cold that could freeze a man in minutes if he wasn't careful. McCall had lived alone for years now. He'd buried his father on this very land, carved a ranch out of the rugged plains by his own sweat and stubbornness. No wife, no children, just the open range and the cattle that kept him company, his only responsibility in this unforgiving stretch of land. The cattle were his family now, and he knew better than anyone the responsibility of keeping them alive. The first snowflakes began to fall, light at first, but in the way the wind was shifting, McCall knew it wouldn't be long before the real storm hit. He turned his back to the wind and moved toward the cabin, taking one last glance at the horizon. The flat plains stretched out before him, an endless sea of snow and wind. Not a soul for miles. Inside the cabin, McCall threw his coat over a chair and sat down at the table, his eyes drifting to the weathered map pinned to the wall. He'd been tracking the storm for days, watching the barometer, listening to the way the wind shifted. It was coming, no doubt about it. The kind of storm that would turn the plains into a frozen wasteland, where cattle could freeze in a matter of hours. He grabbed a pencil and marked a small cross on the map. A storm of this magnitude was rare, but McCall had learned long ago not to take chances with the weather. Most of his neighbors, those who'd built their homes quick and cheap, wouldn't survive if the storm came as hard as he feared. They wouldn't last the winter, not with their poorly built cabins and shallow preparations. He'd seen it happen before. He leaned back in his chair, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. Was it foolish? Maybe. But he had no choice but to prepare, to act. If he couldn't rely on others, he would have to trust in his own instincts, his own preparations. Standing again, McCall moved to the door. The wind outside had picked up. Snow began to fall more heavily now, swirling around in the fading light of afternoon. He knew he had to move fast. He grabbed his hat and coat and stepped outside, the cold biting into him like needles. The storm was here. With a final glance toward the herd, McCall set to work, his breath coming out in sharp bursts. There was no time to waste. Winter was already here, and it had no mercy on anyone, especially those who thought they were prepared but weren't. McCall had been building for months. And now, for better or worse, it was time to see if his work would be enough to protect them all. Thomas McCall had always been methodical in his work. It was the only way to survive on the plains, where a single mistake could cost a man everything. When the storm first started to show its teeth, he knew he had to build something more than just a cabin. Most of the settlers around him were content to throw up makeshift shelters, simple structures with quick fixes. Not McCall. He had watched enough winters come and go to know that those flimsy shelters wouldn't survive anything more than a light dusting of snow. His windbreak was born from that knowledge, a lesson learned in the coldest of winters. He had watched too many animals freeze to death in the past, heard too many stories of men burying their cattle before the snow had even cleared. He refused to let that happen to him. He spent weeks planning, measuring, and gathering the materials. No detail was too small to escape his notice. He selected logs with obsessive care, each one thick, uniform, and strong enough to stand up to the punishing wind. Some of the timber had to be hauled from over 20 miles away, but McCall never hesitated. Every time a log was dragged from the forest, he imagined it standing firm against the howling storm, blocking the wind from his herd. He started with a foundation. Most men didn't bother, but McCall wasn't like most men. He dug a shallow trench and filled it with rocks from the nearby creek. The base would keep the logs stable, ensure that the windbreak didn't shift as the earth froze and thawed. The logs were placed horizontally, stacked tightly in overlapping layers. It was more labor than most men would have cared for, but McCall worked steadily, even through the early frosts. The walls of the windbreak began to take shape, curving around the herd like a protective wall. McCall's design wasn't like anything anyone else had seen before. The walls sloped upward and inward, forming a partial dome, so the wind had no way of sneaking through the cracks. It was a shape that would deflect the worst of the storm, force the wind upward, and keep the snow from piling up inside. Neighbors laughed at him. They called it a crazy idea. A windbreak that large, they said, would never be necessary. But McCall knew better. He could hear the wind on the horizon, smell the storm in the air, and he wasn't about to take chances. He spent long hours stacking each log with precision, making sure that every gap was filled. When the logs were in place, he filled the cracks with snow that had already begun to drift, knowing it would solidify into a dense layer, making the structure even stronger. By the time he finished, he had a nearly impervious barrier, the likes of which no one in the area had ever seen before. The windbreak was ready, and McCall felt a rare surge of satisfaction. The herd was safe, for now. But the storm was coming, and it would test everything he had built. The storm hit fast, catching Thomas McCall off guard despite his preparations. By the afternoon of December 5th, 1879, the winds had started to howl, biting into everything in their path. McCall stood on the porch of his cabin, staring out at the horizon. The first flakes of snow began to fall, swirling in the wind like a swarm of white locusts. He knew the storm would be bad, but the speed with which it arrived made his heart race. He turned and moved inside, grabbing his coat and hat, and headed out to the barn. The cattle were uneasy, pacing in the open field. McCall had been watching the storm for days, but it had still come quicker than expected. His windbreak had been built for a reason, and now he would find out if it was enough. The wind screamed in his ears as he stepped into the open, the snow stinging his face. He could barely see the herd in the distance. Their figures were barely visible through the white haze. McCall cursed under his breath, but there was no time to waste. The storm was closing in fast, and he needed to get the cattle into shelter before the worst of it hit. His boots crunched through the snow as he moved toward the herd, shouting at the cattle to get them moving. They stampeded, shaking their heads against the cold, but McCall didn't stop. His hand rested on the rifle at his side, not because he expected trouble, but out of habit. His mind was focused entirely on the herd, guiding them toward the windbreak. The wind had picked up, cutting through his clothes like a blade. By the time McCall reached the herd, the snow was falling so thickly that he could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The cattle were huddled together, pressing close to the earth for warmth. It didn't take much more than a firm hand to guide them toward the windbreak, where they immediately pressed themselves into the shelter. McCall surveyed the windbreak for any signs of weakness. The logs were sturdy, but he knew that the storm could test the limits of any structure. The snow was already starting to build up on the outside, packing into the gaps between the logs and solidifying into a thick shell. It was exactly what he had hoped for. Nature was helping him make the windbreak stronger. Still, McCall remained vigilant, watching for any sign that the storm might overwhelm his creation. The wind screamed above him, bending the trees and rattling the remaining branches. He pulled his coat tighter around him and checked on the cattle, making sure they were safe. The snow continued to fall, blanketing everything in white. By the time night fell, McCall was exhausted, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out of his control. The windbreak had held, but would it hold through the night? For 2 days, the storm didn't relent. The wind continued its unholy howl, and the snow piled higher, drifting across the plains like an endless sheet of white. By the time the sun had set on December 7th, the temperature had plummeted to below zero, and McCall knew the worst was yet to come. The windbreak was standing strong, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of doubt creeping into his mind. He had spent months preparing, but there was always the question of whether it would be enough. The storm had exceeded his expectations. He had heard stories of cattle freezing to death in similar blizzards, their bodies stiff in the morning frost, their hooves still sunk deep in the snow. It was the kind of thing a man couldn't ignore when he lived so close to nature's merciless edge. Inside the windbreak, the cattle were huddled together, their breath fogging the air. They seemed calm, but McCall knew animals didn't always react to danger the way a man might expect. They could freeze in place if the cold was too much for them, or they could scatter, causing chaos. So far, the herd had remained relatively quiet, but McCall kept watch. The fire in the makeshift hearth he'd built inside the windbreak crackled and popped, sending faint warmth into the surrounding cold. He sat with his back to the fire, watching the cattle through the swirling snowflakes outside the windbreak's narrow window. He had built the structure precisely for moments like this, but even with everything in place, the storm still seemed an unbeatable adversary. McCall's thoughts shifted to the past, his father, his partner, all the people who had built too quickly, too cheaply. He thought of them when he saw the other homesteaders' small, hastily thrown-up shelters, their cabins barely more than a roof over their heads. He had heard their mocking words when he started building, their dismissals of his crazy windbreak. Yet, in the pit of his stomach, McCall knew they wouldn't make it through the storm. They hadn't prepared for the worst, and now nature was showing them just how harsh it could be. The fire flickered in the hearth, and McCall stood, walking over to stoke it. The warmth felt good, but it was fleeting. The cold wind still screamed outside, relentless and biting. He couldn't be sure yet if his shelter would truly hold through the full fury of the storm, but there was something in the way the snow packed up against the windbreak that gave him hope. He moved to the door, checking the logs one more time. The structure hadn't shifted. It had stood firm, weathering the storm as he had hoped. For now, at least, it seemed McCall's faith in his work had been rewarded. By the morning of December 9th, the storm had yet to loosen its grip on the plains. The snow continued to fall in thick, suffocating sheets, and the wind cut through the land like a blade. McCall awoke in the early hours, already stiff from the cold, his breath visible in the dim light of the cabin. The fire in the hearth had burned low, its warmth barely enough to keep him from freezing as he got to his feet. He dressed quickly, wrapping himself in layers of wool and thick leather. Outside, the snow had accumulated against the windbreak, forming a wall that looked almost as solid as the logs themselves. McCall stepped outside, feeling the sting of the wind against his face. The cold air seemed to tear through him, but he didn't flinch. His only thought was the cattle. The herd was still huddled inside the windbreak, their thick coats huddled together for warmth. But McCall could see the signs of strain. They were restless, stomping their hooves in the snow, moving in tight circles. He knew the storm was taking its toll on them, and it wouldn't be long before panic set in. He had seen it before: the confusion, the frantic movement of cattle when they were exposed to too much cold. He stood at the edge of the windbreak, watching the storm's fury as it raged across the plains. The wind howled, shaking the logs of the windbreak as though it were testing the structure, trying to find a weakness. The thought of the windbreak failing, of his cattle being exposed to the full brunt of the storm, gnawed at him. The storm was fierce, relentless, and McCall knew that the worst could still be ahead. The snow, thick and heavy, continued to fall. It had been accumulating so quickly that McCall could barely see past the windbreak's walls. His breath fogged in the air as he moved closer, checking the cattle once more. He could hear their low, anxious murmurs, a sign that they were growing increasingly uncomfortable. Then a sudden noise, the loud, frantic stamp of hooves. McCall's heart skipped a beat as the cattle surged, moving toward the farthest corner of the shelter, pushing each other in their panic. They were trying to escape, to get away from the storm, but there was no way out. "Steady, girl," McCall muttered, his voice low and calm as he stepped into the herd, grabbing hold of the nearest cow. He stroked her neck, soothing her with slow, steady words. The other cattle settled, but McCall could see the fear in their eyes. He knew the storm had reached a breaking point for them and for him. The windbreak was holding, but it wasn't a guarantee. McCall knew there was only so much nature's fury could be held back. He'd built for the worst, but even the best preparation could only go so far. The storm would push them all to their limits. By December 12th, the storm had finally begun to wane. The wind no longer howled like it had during the previous days, but the snow continued to fall lightly, blanketing the plains in a soft, eerie silence. McCall stood at the edge of the windbreak, his gaze steady on the horizon. The storm was still present in the cold, but the worst was over. His cattle, now calmer, had weathered the brunt of it, huddled within the shelter of the windbreak. The windbreak had proven its worth. The walls of logs had held firm, and though the snow piled high against them, it had only strengthened the shelter, adding a thick layer of insulation. McCall moved among his cattle, checking each one for signs of frostbite or injury, but they were in surprisingly good condition considering the ferocity of the storm. His work had paid off. As the days passed, the storm's aftermath left the plains quiet and still. The windbreak, once a point of ridicule, was now the subject of quiet admiration. Word had spread among the nearby settlers, and more than once McCall had seen the figure of a rider approaching from the distance. At first he had thought they were seeking shelter, but soon it became clear that it was more than just curiosity. The storm had taken its toll on everyone, and many had found their cabins less than sufficient. One morning, William Crawford, the neighbor who had once mocked McCall's windbreak, rode up to the shelter with his own cattle trailing behind. The older man's face was tired, the kind of exhaustion that only came from surviving a storm that should have killed you. He pulled his horse to a stop and looked around at the shelter, his eyes lingering on the sturdy walls of the windbreak. "You were right," Crawford said, his voice rough with cold and fatigue. "I called it foolish. Guess I was wrong." McCall didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave a nod, though he wasn't sure if Crawford was asking for forgiveness or just acknowledging his survival. He knew the windbreak had saved his herd, but the satisfaction of being right was a hollow victory. Crawford, still not getting down from his horse, shifted in the saddle. "I've got more cattle out there," he continued, pointing toward the snow-covered horizon. "Some of 'em didn't make it. The storm. It took 'em. Thought I could manage without extra preparation, but it's clear now." McCall didn't interrupt. He simply watched as Crawford's words trailed off. There was no need for any "I told you so." The storm had already done its damage. Instead, McCall gestured toward the windbreak. "You can rest them here," he said simply. Crawford, his pride bruised but his need for survival greater, nodded. He turned his horse around and led his herd toward the shelter, where McCall's cattle were already settled. It was the first of many times McCall would share his windbreak with others during the long winter, each time knowing that his careful, laborious design had saved not just his herd, but those of his neighbors as well. The snow had settled into a thick, unyielding blanket by the end of December, and the windbreak had become more than just a shelter. It was a lifeline. Thomas McCall spent his days checking the cattle, stoking the fire, and watching the world outside. The storm's fury had subsided, but the cold was far from over. For days, the temperature remained far below freezing, and the wind, though less intense, still cut through the plains like a knife. It wasn't long before more settlers showed up at McCall's windbreak. He had heard the riders approaching from miles away, their horses' hooves crunching through the deep snow, the faint sound of voices carried by the wind. The first to arrive after Crawford were the Johnsons. Peter Johnson, a young man with a wife and 3 children, had been living a few miles north of McCall. The storm had left his small cabin in ruins, and with the railroad blocked by drifts and the stores running low, he had no choice but to seek refuge. McCall met him at the edge of the windbreak, his hand on his rifle, but he had no need for it. The desperation in Johnson's eyes told the story. Johnson's wife had been ill with pneumonia for days, the cold air making her condition worse. His children were sick too, their faces pale and cracked from the harsh wind. They had no firewood left and no food to spare. Without a word, McCall stepped aside, gesturing for Johnson to bring his family inside. "You've got shelter here. Rest them. I've got firewood for now," McCall said. For 3 days, the Johnsons stayed in the windbreak. McCall shared his stores of food, which were carefully rationed, and kept the fire going as best he could. He spent most of his time outside, keeping watch over the cattle, ensuring the windbreak held up under the weight of the snow that continued to build against it. The storm had passed, but the bitter winter had only just begun. On the fourth day, Johnson returned with a word of thanks, his wife having recovered enough to travel. But there was more to the story. As he spoke, McCall learned that other settlers were coming to seek shelter. One by one, families were finding their way to McCall's windbreak, drawn by word of its safety. They had seen their own shelters fail, some unable to keep out the wind or the cold. McCall had built his windbreak for his own cattle, but now it had become a sanctuary for the people of the plains. By the time January rolled around, McCall had sheltered more than a dozen people. The windbreak, originally mocked as too large, too extravagant, had become the heart of a community that had been scattered by the storm. McCall didn't expect praise, but he could feel a shift in the air, a quiet respect building as the storm raged on outside. His caution had been vindicated. The windbreak had stood, and with it, the people who had nowhere else to go. By the end of February, the storm's relentless assault had given way to a more subdued cold. The snow, though still deep, had hardened under the weight of countless days of winter. Thomas McCall stood in the doorway of his windbreak, watching the barren landscape, his face weathered by weeks of biting wind and solitude. The worst was over. The cattle were alive, his neighbors had survived, and the storm was finally a distant memory, though the scars it left were permanent. Yet, as he watched the horizon, McCall couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. His work had kept everyone alive, but there had been losses along the way. John Marshall, a settler from the next homestead over, had not been so lucky. His cabin had fallen victim to the storm early in December, and though he had managed to make it to McCall's windbreak with his cattle, the cold had taken its toll. Marshall's wife, Evelyn, had died from pneumonia. The loss was devastating, not just for Marshall, but for the entire group that had gathered at McCall's shelter. It had been McCall's windbreak that saved them all, but it hadn't been enough for Evelyn. McCall stood still, feeling the weight of the loss hanging in the air. Marshall had been one of those who had laughed at McCall's efforts to build something so elaborate. But now, after the death of his wife, there were no more words of mockery, only sorrow and regret. The loss of Marshall's wife was a bitter reminder of the price of survival. McCall knew that no matter how well built his windbreak had been, there were still things beyond his control. The storm, the cold, and the isolation had claimed its victims, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. McCall had done everything right, but the land had its own rules, and sometimes those rules couldn't be bent. A few days later, Marshall came by, his face haggard from grief, but his eyes clear. He didn't speak much, but McCall could see the change in him. No longer the man who had ridiculed McCall for building something so extravagant, Marshall now saw the windbreak for what it was, a lifeline. "I've rebuilt," Marshall said quietly, his voice rough. "The cabin's done. It's stronger now, thanks to you. I just wish I had done it right the first time." There was no anger in his words, no resentment. Only the quiet acceptance of a man who had learned the hard way. McCall nodded, but said nothing. He didn't need to speak. They both knew that the windbreak had saved many lives, but it hadn't been able to save everything. There was no true victory in survival, not when it came at the cost of someone else's life. The windbreak had stood, the cattle had lived. But as McCall looked out over the plains, the harsh truth lingered. The winter had broken them all in some way. By the time the snow had melted and April settled over the plains, Thomas McCall had settled into the quiet rhythm of spring. The cattle were grazing once more, their thick coats shedding in the warming sun, and the land was beginning to show its first green shoots after months of white. The plains, so harsh and unforgiving just a few months ago, now seemed almost peaceful, bathed in the soft light of the early season. Yet, the memories of the winter, of the storm, and of those who had survived and those who had not remained deeply etched in McCall's mind. The windbreak stood firm in the distance, its logs still solid, the snow that had piled high against it now replaced with only the marks of the storm's passing. McCall had watched it hold strong through the worst of the winter, but it was no longer just a place of survival, it had become a symbol. For McCall, however, it wasn't the structure that weighed heavily on his heart, but the lives it had touched. The families that had come to him for shelter, the neighbors he had watched suffer, and those who had not made it. The storm had taken lives, but the windbreak had saved many, and McCall knew it. As the first warm winds of spring began to blow across the plains, McCall couldn't help but notice the changes around him. His neighbors, the ones who had mocked him for his elaborate windbreak, had rebuilt. William Crawford, once the loudest critic, had replaced his flimsy shelter with something stronger, thicker walls, a stone foundation, and a reinforced roof. It was a far cry from the hastily built cabin that had nearly succumbed to the storm. McCall had noticed this new construction style on several other homesteads. They had all learned something from the winter, something that could never be unlearned. McCall spent a quiet afternoon walking through the now familiar landscape, his mind drifting back to the families who had taken refuge in the windbreak. Peter Johnson and his sick wife Evelyn Marshall, who had been buried that winter. Her death still weighed heavily on McCall, though he rarely spoke of it. The windbreak had saved the others, but Evelyn's loss felt like a quiet reminder of how fragile survival could be. Peter had left, taking his family further south to relatives, but he promised McCall he would send others in need. As McCall stood at the edge of the windbreak, he saw the cattle grazing peacefully. His hard work had been worth it, but the cost of survival had been high. The others might have built their cabins stronger, but it wasn't just the structure that had kept them alive. It was the quiet, stubborn conviction to endure the same conviction McCall had shown when he built his windbreak, and the same conviction that had made him the one everyone turned to in times of need. The prairie was alive again, but McCall's work, his sacrifice, remained. By the summer of 1885, Thomas McCall had long since stopped seeking praise or recognition. The brutal winter, with all its hardships, had passed, and with it had come a sense of quiet relief. The cattle were healthy now, their coats thick under the summer sun, and the grass stretched across the plains in waves of green. The windbreak that had once been the center of ridicule now stood as a testament to McCall's persistence. The structure, solid as ever, was a quiet monument to survival, standing firm against the changing seasons. The logs, weathered by time, had proved themselves to be more than just shelter. They had been the difference between life and death. The herd, having survived the worst of the storm, now grazed freely in the fields, their numbers swelling as the years passed. As McCall sat on the porch of his cabin, his eyes often wandered to the windbreak. It wasn't just a structure anymore, it had become a symbol. Over the months, he had watched his neighbors, those who had once mocked him for his overzealous building, slowly rebuild their own cabins. This time their walls were thicker, their roofs more secure, and their woodpiles stacked high. The lessons from that winter had been learned the hard way. What had once been considered foolish now seemed nothing short of wisdom. Word of McCall's windbreak spread beyond the neighboring homesteads, and travelers, some of them strangers to the plains, came by to see the shelter that had withstood the worst winter anyone could remember. Many of them, having heard the tale of the cowboy who had built the crazy structure, were eager to learn from him. McCall shared what he had learned, though he did so without fanfare or expectation. His advice was simple, rooted in the quiet confidence of a man who had survived the worst. Build for the worst you can imagine, and if you're wrong, then you've wasted some time. But if you're right, you'll save more than just yourself. But McCall wasn't concerned with the admiration of strangers. The real reward for him was in seeing the change in his neighbors. Families who had once lived in makeshift shelters now had homes strong enough to withstand any storm. They'd learned the lesson of that long winter, and they had built with the kind of care McCall had put into his windbreak. In the year 1890, a group of young settlers arrived at McCall's homestead, eager to see the legendary windbreak for themselves. They weren't looking for shelter, they were looking for wisdom. McCall greeted them with quiet humility, offering them a place to rest, and as always, a few words of advice. Build for the worst. Hope you're wrong. But if you're right, you'll survive. Thomas McCall passed away in 1925 at the age of 74. The Windbreak, which had withstood decades of storms, remained standing for many years after. When it was finally dismantled, it was not because it had failed, but because it had fulfilled its purpose. It had saved lives, protected cattle, and taught those who came after him how to survive. The legacy of the Windbreak lived on in the homes that were built stronger, the cattle that were cared for with greater wisdom, and in the stories passed down through generations of settlers.